we could probably stop right now because Ian's pretty much covered everything I have to say. So if you just want to leave it at that, I can step into the background and just listen to the questions. If not, we can proceed. Maybe I can add a little bit to what he's had to say. So,
please proceed, Bill.
what I want to do is two things, really. And the first is to prick the fantasy bubble. Right now, most of the world is lunging forward on the idea that climate change is the problem confronting us. And I think Ian has already, Shappy has already put that to rest. But there's a lot more to it than that. So first of all, let's put climate change aside for a moment and recognize that the real problem is something else. And I want to do this to better equip all of us to engage in the policy discussions that lie ahead. First of all, climate change is important, but it's certainly not the existential threat. What we have to keep in mind is that renewable energy, and mostly right now, about 94% of the investment in the world in renewables is going into wind turbines and solar photovoltaics. It's not even the solution to climate change. And for one thing, it can't quantitatively replace fossil fuels. So we are going to have, in fact, we're already beginning to have a bit of an energy crisis if you've been following the news coming from Europe. In any event, almost all of these so-called renewables are both ecologically and socially damaging. All are dependent on fossil fuels. All the wind turbines and solar panels on the planet are made using fossil fuels, and we'll have to replace all of the equipment currently using fossil fuels with equipment capable of using electricity produced in inadequate quantities by the non-solution of wind and solar power. So that's a tremendous commitment of fossil fuel just to replace fossil fuels. So they're not really renewable and merely replaceable. Wind turbines wear out after about 15 years and solar panels 25 to 30 years. So you have to start all over again within a short period of time. So the real problem, and Ian has emphasized this, and I won't belabor it, is overshoot. And what this means is that we are using the biological assets of the planet in excess of the regenerative capacity of ecosystems, and we're polluting in excess of the assimilation capacity of the natural environment. So this means we're literally consuming and polluting the biophysical basis of our own existence, and that's the definition of biophysical unsustainability. Here are a whole bunch of other symptoms. I would say at least two of them are at least as important as climate change in the dilemma confronting us. But the bottom line is this: all of these things are caused by overshoot. Climate change is just one symptom. Addressing any of these symptoms in isolation cannot solve the problem of overshoot. And untreated, overshoot is a terminal condition. You cannot continue to degrade the biophysical basis of your own existence without, at some point, going into a terminal collapse situation. Obviously, climate change is a good and well-known symptom. We know from the data that, for example, the last 6 years have been the warmest in the instrumental record. In fact, 9 of the 10 warmest years have occurred since 2005. So there's no question, this is a big deal. But other symptoms are just as important. If we look at biodiversity, which Ian touched upon, we have rough estimates of the biomass of various species going back 10,000 years. And if we go back then, this is about the dawn of agriculture, wild mammals were about 99% of the total weight biomass of mammals on Earth. Humans were much less than 1%. But with the advent of agriculture, at about this time actually, and more recently fossil fuel, things have changed dramatically. So humans now comprise 32% of the biomass of mammals on the planet. Cattle and other livestock comprise another 67%. So altogether, humans have now taken over somewhere between different estimates, but 95 to 98% of the biomass of mammals, leaving wild mammals with only 1% of the total biomass. So those great herds that we see in nature series on television are reduced to a tiny fraction of their former existence. They've literally been competitively displaced by human beings, because on a finite planet where all creatures are living on the constant throughput of a limited amount of solar energy, the more humans take, the less is available for everything else. So we've literally competitively displaced non-human wildlife from their ecosystem, from their ecological niches, and we're taking over their habitats and food supplies. And it's not just mammals. Wild bird populations are tumbling. Domestic poultry now constitutes 70% of the bird biomass on Earth. The average populations of monitored species of wild vertebrates have declined by 60% in just the last 50 years. And populations of invertebrates are also in free fall. Various estimates, very controversial, but nevertheless pretty evident. Now, we have to take very careful regard of this graph. This is simply a plot of human population growth over the last 10,000 years, the series, the sequence that I've looked at. And you can see that through most of this period, and in fact, we could extend the axis to the left by a couple of 100,000 years, human populations fluctuated in the vicinity of their local carrying capacities. Growth didn't occur. Growth is a relatively recent phenomenon, the result of, in the first place, agriculture, but most particularly with the access to abundant supplies of fossil fuels early in the 19th century. In fact, just about 200 years ago. Now, what fossil fuel did was relieve humans of all the negative feedback that kept us down. Every species, including human beings, are capable of exponential growth. But normally in ecosystems, there are factors that maintain populations within the carrying capacity of their ecosystem. Food shortages, overcrowding, competition, predation, and so on and so forth. But with fossil fuel, we in effect eliminated the shortages of energy, resources, food, and so on, so that for the first time in our entire evolutionary history, just 200 years ago, we were freed and were able to express our full potential as a biological species for exponential growth. So we've seen for 200 years a phenomenon, 10 generations of people out of thousands who take growth to be normal, or at least this type of growth to be normal. But we have to keep in mind that what you're observing here is the single most abnormal period in the history of our species. And it's almost entirely the result of our abundant use of fossil fuel. This just nails that point home. We can see a 6 times increase in population, a 9-fold increase in energy use per capita, and a 55-fold increase in energy use in total, 1850 through 2010. Exponential growth is really interesting. Humans don't generally understand it. But look at this curve. This is the real curve for oil and gas coal use in the last, half century or more. 50% of all the fossil fuels ever consumed on planet Earth have been consumed since 1991. So roughly 30 years. Do you see what I'm saying? In the last doubling of the human enterprise, we've used half of the energy ever used by human beings, fossil energy. I happen to have been born in 1943. So 90% of all the fossil fuel ever used has been used in my lifetime. No other generation of human beings can make a statement like that. That's how incredibly unique this period is, and we take it to be for granted. It's an absolutely astonishing oversight that we don't teach our children a little bit more about the growth phenomenon under exponential terms. So the consumption of just about everything else has also exploded. We needn't belabor the point. The point is that all of this has led to this state of overshoot. We were among the first to quantify it with our ecological footprint analysis. What we're able to show is that on Earth, planet Earth today, these data are from 2017, I think now, the global availability of what we call biocapacity, just the total amount of productive ecosystems on land and water. So grazing land, forest lands, agricultural lands, fishing grounds, and so on and so forth, is about 12.1 billion hectares. That's all there is on the planet. And yet in that same year, 2007 or 2017, humans were using the Earth as if it were 20.9 billion hectares. So the difference is overshoot. and it's a factor of 73%. How is this possible that we can use the Earth as if it were 23 or 73% larger than it is? And the answer is that we're drawing down natural capital assets that took millennia to accumulate in the ecosphere. So the massive forests, the huge accumulation of rich soils, of fish stocks, and so on and so forth, that took hundreds, and in some cases even millennia to accumulate, are being now depleted thousands of times faster than they can regenerate in nature. So we can do this until we're flat out, of course, of any resources, but that will be just a few more years. Everyone on Earth is currently now competing with everyone else for a shrinking biocapacity. So there's the double dilemma. We continue to grow by 80 million people a year, the economy by 2 or 3% per year, which means doubling in just 23 to 35 years. And yet the biomass upon which we survive, the capacity of the ecosphere is declining with every depletion of assets that we are responsible for. So basically, we need to understand overshoot even to fix climate change. Overshoot results from too many people consuming too much energy and too much material resources and discharging excessive wastes. Solving climate change by any politically acceptable means, solar PV, wind turbines, electronic vehicles, carbon capture and storage, and all of these things will not stop climate change. Why? Because this whole approach, it comes from a mainstream perspective that is designed, and you can go online and look this up, to encourage massive investment. Lots of different investment corporations see climate change as a huge opportunity to make profits. So the entire approach to climate change is designed to encourage investment in high-tech manufacturing, to create jobs, and basically to enable continued growth. I call this business as usual by alternative means, and it will in fact not fix climate change because it's fossil dependent in the first instance, and it's going to exacerbate overshoot. On the other hand, if we actually approach overshoot, we can reverse not only climate change, but address all of the other significant symptoms. Now, I've always been fascinated by how we got into this mess. So what's really going on here? How can Homo sapiens, allegedly the wise man, have made such a mess of things? And the reason I think is that the human brain evolved to cope with very small tribal groups in relatively knowable, predictable ecosystems, very small home ranges. So there was no need to think much beyond that. And we naturally tend to think in rather simplistic, linear reductionist ways, simple cause-effect relationships. And that was adequate for the 250,000 years of human evolutionary history until very recently. Modern techno-industrial humans have created a world of mind-boggling, multiple overlapping, global scale, rapidly changing, non-linear systems that make up the complex modern human world system. But our brains are not neurocognitively equipped to understand, let alone control any of that. We cannot truly grasp the workings of the global economy, geopolitics, or the internet, let alone the climate system and the ecosphere. So we've literally lost control of the system that we ourselves have created. There's another issue here. I mentioned that humans, like all other species, have this capacity for exponential growth. And indeed, it's always existed, but it has been constrained by that negative feedback. But once that was released, we expressed our full biological potential shared with all other species to expand to fill all accessible habitats and to use all available resources. And in the case of humans, of course, availability is constantly being refined by refinements in technology. New Zealand was occupied by humans, I guess, what, about 800, the year 800? So it's an example of the expansion of humans into all accessible habitats all over the planet. And we now have the largest geographic range of any species, except perhaps the rats and mice that follow us around. And we're scraping the bottom of the of our planetary barrel for resources. So we're the best expression of these two tendencies of any species on Earth. There's another problem because overshoot is exacerbated by nurture as well. So on the one hand, we have a natural predisposition to expand, but we also have created mental constructs that aid this. And humans are unique in that we socially construct our realities. Basically, we make it up as we go along. But it's more accurate to say that we're not constructing reality, obviously. We construct conceptual lenses through which we perceive the real world. And some of these we call political ideology, religious doctrines, economic paradigms, scientific models, or cultural narratives. The trouble is that these conceptual lenses that we construct, these are made up through social discourse, determine how we perceive reality, okay? And then we live out of our constructed realities as if they were real. So right now, we are inhabitants of something called modern techno-industrial society, and we are living out of an elaborate social construct called neoliberal economics. The problem is that neoliberal economics promotes unlimited economic growth. That's a social construct derived from our very recent history of growth and enabled by continuous technological advances. And this reinforces our innate propensity to expand. And you can see various statements in the literature of this. One of the ones I like best is Julian Simon. We have in our hands now the technology to feed, clothe, and supply energy to an ever-growing population for the next 7 billion years. That's not human modesty talking. Now, control theory or cybernetics has given us two very powerful statements to understand what's wrong with neoliberal economics. The first is we cannot regulate our interaction with any aspect of reality that our model of reality does not include. So right now we're trying to run the world with a model of reality called neoliberal economics, but it contains no useful information about the real world. That brings up Ashley's law of requisite variety. Basically, if you're trying to manage something, your management system has to match the diversity and number of states of the system that you're trying to manage. And if it doesn't, you have a problem. Quote, when the variety or complexity of the environment exceeds the capacity, the variety or complexity of the regulatory system, the environment will dominate and ultimately destroy that system. So our economic construct has to be evaluated in the context of Ashby's law. Neoliberal economics is simplistically reductionist. It comes from that primitive brain. Its basic models contain zero useful information about the structure or dynamics of the ecological or social systems with which the economy interacts in the real world. Neoliberal economics is utterly incompetent to guide modern culture's interactions with either biophysical or social reality. So here we are trying to fly a planet of infinite complexity with a model that contains no information about the nature of that environment at all. And in case you think I'm spinning my wheels here or making this up, here's a graph that appears in just about every standard economics textbook. It's called the circular flow of exchange value. And it's the basic model of the economy, which sees businesses and households in a mutually reinforcing relationship. Households spend money on goods and services provided by industry, but industry provides wages and salaries to households in exchange for labor and investment capital. And with each cycle here, the system grows, but you'll notice there's no connection to anything outside of itself. So the fundamental model assumes the economy is separate from and exists independently of the ecosphere, when in fact, this is a more accurate description of the reality. So again, we see that economic model down below, but the goods and services are produced entirely from available energy and matter extracted from the ecosphere, which contains the economy. And all of that energy and material sucked into the economy is returned to the ecosphere as degraded, dissipated energy and matter. And by the way, this includes all the final products. So everything that enters the economy returns to the environment. It's not an environment at all. It's the ecosphere that contains the economy as degraded, high entropic waste. And that then is our problem. We're over-consuming from the left and over-polluting on the right. We in Overshoot are really a malignant parasite on the planet. We are gaining the vitality. The growth and maintenance of the human enterprise occurs at the expense of the reduced vitality of our host ecosphere. We're literally polluting and consuming our host ecosphere from the inside out. And propelled by this constructed growth narrative, we cannot even implement our own negotiated climate agreements. So this is a simple plot of the increasing carbon dioxide concentrations over the past, 60 or 70 years or so. And you can see a steady increase. All is going up, and we've marked on here the major climate agreements that we've reached. I've also put in the limits to growth volume, the world scientists warning to humanity back in 1992. We're heading now to Glasgow in 2021, when the carbon dioxide has now reached 417 parts per million, which is almost 50% above pre-industrial levels. And the point of this curve is to show not just the increase in carbon emissions, but the fact that none of the agreements that we've entered into, none of the international conferences have had any effect whatsoever. You can't detect the date of their occurrence on these curves. It may have been steeper had we not had those meetings, but the point is we've done nothing to reverse climate. And again, I come back to this curve. The driving factor is the exponential growth of the fossil-powered human enterprise. Well, we have to look back at that curve because there is a warning from population ecology. What goes up will come down. And this is taken straight out of a standard textbook on ecology. It shows the boom-bust cycle that occurs in some species when introduced to a new habitat with plentiful resources. There's a boom, a phase as the resources feed the exponential growth of that population, just as we see in the human case. And the whole point of this is to show that as matters stand, the expansion of the human enterprise resembles this early boom phase or plague phase of a one-off population boom-bust cycle. And it wouldn't be the first time. These are real data from reindeer populations introduced to islands offshore Alaska when there's plenty of lichens. Populations boom and then bust when they run out of resources. Well, humans are no different. The only way that we can really fix overshoot, and with it climate change and so on, is through significant reductions. And that means 50% overall globally and up to 80% in rich countries of energy and material throughput. That is the scale of overshoot at the present time. The 73% that I showed you earlier amounts to 50% global reductions and 80% reductions in rich countries. If we wish to reach a to equilibrate again with the natural ecosphere. So to act consistently with our best science would require a planned economic and population contraction to perhaps the 1 or 2 billion people who could live more equitably and quite decently within the means of nature. Overshoot is that extensive at the present time. The choice before us is simple in some sense and very difficult in another. Overshoot is a terminal condition. If we stay on this track, there's no question that the human enterprise will contract violently, as other species do when they deplete their fundamental resource base. But we apparently are an intelligent, plan-capable species, and we can therefore theoretically choose between business as usual, which means risking a chaotic implosion imposed by nature, followed by geopolitical turmoil and resource wars, or we can decide that we can avoid all of that by a well-planned, orderly, cooperative descent toward a socially just sustainability. I didn't know about the curve that Ian showed us. This is my own from the work I'm talking. It's very similar, of course. Carrying capacity and overshoot. When you overshoot carrying capacity, you lose carrying capacity. So we should have followed the green curve. The green curve would be the curve of an intelligent species recognizing that it's approaching its planetary carrying capacity and organizing to control its population level and levels of consumption to remain below that carrying capacity. As matters stand, we've gone into overshoot. There's been a loss of carrying capacity. So the best we can do now is to drop down from the height of our overshoot to the dotted red line, which is as I say, where carrying capacity currently stands. The other option, of course, is the systemic collapse and following the solid red line. Well, the record so far, because human beings are natural discounters, place much more importance on the present day than future days, on our friends and relatives than on unknown strangers far away, and so on. So far, we've chosen that first option, business as usual, but alternative means. It's a way using new technologies to save the economy and maintain the growth ethic. But this is delusional on the planet in which we live. Part of the problem is that we live in an age of unreason, science denial, and magical thinking. We've entered the endarkenment as opposed to the enlightenment. There are literally hundreds of websites dedicated to denying everything we've talked about in this meeting and to deluding people into thinking all is well. And again, since we socially construct our we much prefer the reassuring lie to the inconvenient truth that we've been addressing here today. So again, we are simple-brained. We choose simple, linear solutions, but they're dead wrong in a very complex world. So right now, wind turbines, solar photovoltaics, electric vehicles, smart cities, geoengineering, and so on are the favored solutions to our problem. Unfortunately, they will lead to continued overshoot and a greater fall than if we take things seriously. The complex solutions, but perhaps right in the circumstances, means reducing the eco footprint, lifestyle changes, degrowth leading to improved well-being, including social and economic security. So we need a new cultural narrative. We have to make up a new story by which we live, recognizing that the human economy is a fully contained, dependent subsystem of the non-growing ecosphere. Completely different concept from thinking of the economy as a totally separate and independent solution. The cult of growth, which simply means quantitative accretion or getting bigger through techno-efficiency, must be replaced with an emphasis on development, which means qualitative improvement and greater social equity. So what we're really aiming for here, if we were smart enough to recognize it globally, is a goal towards smaller, steady-state economies in which fewer people can thrive more equitably within the regenerative means of nature. Nature supports us. We can't destroy the basis of our own support. So some of the things that should be done are an immediate phase out of non-essential and frivolous uses of fossil fuel, including all private vehicles, and that means electronic vehicles as well. They're not that much better than gas-powered vehicles in the long run. ATVs, jet skis, leaf blowers, air transportation, and so on. We should allocate the remaining fossil fuel to essential uses, such as in agriculture and food processing. Our food supply is utterly dependent on fossil fuels. It will not be electrified. So what are we doing? Burning up our last fossil fuel budget to maintain automobiles on the road, for example. We need strong carbon taxes and depletion taxes and move toward full social cost pricing. Almost everything you buy in the market today externalizes much of the cost of production. And that's simply economically unsound. We need to relocalize essential manufacturing and food production, design fair income taxes and a minimum income strategy. We need to reorganize settlements into more self-reliant, steady-state, urban-centered bioregions, integrating into their local ecosystems. With the loss of fossil fuel, global trade and globalization will begin to break down. We're already beginning to see the problem with broken supply lines just as a result of the little blip caused by the COVID pandemic. We need to become more self-reliant on a local, certainly national level. We need to store the ecosystems and life support services that nature provides. We need to implement a global non-coercive population reduction plan. Now, none of that will fly today. It may be ecologically necessary, but what is ecologically and socially necessary for sustainability is not politically feasible. I'm told this all, that may be true, but it's not feasible. Unfortunately, the politically feasible is ecologically and socially ineffective, if not catastrophic. So, assuming that present trends continue, the odds are quite good that humans will become the best informed extinct species on the planet.